In the cold blue skies above Europe, February 1944 brought a sound the Germans had grown to dread: dozens of American bombers droning steadily toward their cities. But this time, something was different. This time, they weren't alone. High above the squadrons of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, a new kind of aircraft danced in the thin air, sleek, silver, and fast. The P-51 Mustangs carved white contrails across the upper atmosphere. Their polished bodies gleamed in the winter sunlight, gliding not behind the bombers, but alongside them, even past them. Radar operators on the German frontier leaned in close to their screens. At first, the pattern looked familiar: waves of bombers, slow and determined. But then came the echoes of smaller, faster objects. Fighters, yes, but they weren't turning back. They weren't peeling off at the border or short of the Ruhr. These escorts were heading all the way in, straight toward Berlin. German commanders were stunned. Until now, Allied fighters couldn't escort bombers deep into the Reich. They had always turned back too soon, leaving bombers to fend for themselves against the Luftwaffe. That was when the real slaughter began. But on this day, something had changed. Up in the sky, the bomber crews noticed it too. Waist gunners leaned out of their gun bays and stared in disbelief. Instead of feeling isolated and exposed, they were surrounded by protection. Mustang pilots kept pace with them, banking in slow turns, eyes scanning for enemy interceptors. The men in the bombers called them angels with engines. One gunner later wrote in a letter, "We couldn't believe it. Usually we started praying around the halfway mark. But that day, the Mustangs were still with us." Far below, civilians in German towns looked up and saw the vast trails spidering out across the sky. They had grown used to bomber raids, but the silver fighters weaving above the bombers were new. Children pointed, and some adults stood still, uneasy. Change was coming. Inside Luftwaffe command rooms, maps were updated in real time, but the old assumptions no longer held. If the Allies now had long-range escorts, the entire strategy of attrition was in danger. The Luftwaffe had relied on catching bombers without protection deep in German airspace. Now that moment was vanishing, and for the men in the air, the effect was immediate. Bomber morale surged. German pilots, scrambling from airfields, began to ask questions they had never asked before. That morning was only the beginning, but it marked the start of a shift of feeling in the air that the balance of power had tilted. The Mustangs had arrived, and they weren't just here to fight. They were here to stay. Before the Mustang's silver wings sliced through German skies, the Allies had a serious problem. Their bombers could reach deep into enemy territory, but their fighter escorts couldn't. In 1943, American commanders watched in horror as B-17s flew bravely into Germany, only to be torn apart by the Luftwaffe once the fighters turned back. Over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Bremen, bomber formations lost dozens of aircraft in a single day. Veteran crews were wiped out. New ones didn't last long. The bombers had courage. They had guns, but they didn't have protection when it mattered most. Inside Allied planning rooms, this became a crisis. Air superiority was slipping. The dream of breaking Germany from the air seemed to be dying over the fatherland. General Henry Hop Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, knew something had to change. His words were simple but urgent. "We must find a fighter that can go all the way." There were candidates. The P-38 Lightning had range, but struggled in the cold, high altitudes over Europe. The P-47 Thunderbolt was powerful, but heavy and fuel-hungry. Both had successes, but neither could go the distance. Then a quiet option appeared almost by accident. North American Aviation had been building a training aircraft for the British, but when asked to improve on an old RAF design, they offered to start fresh. Their engineers worked fast, designing a prototype from scratch. In just 120 days, a new aircraft rolled out, the NA-73X. It was fast, nimble, and had long legs. But at first, it was only given a second-rate engine. Still, it showed promise. Pilots who flew the early Mustang noticed something rare: it handled beautifully. Its wings were elegant, thin, and efficient. It flew higher and faster than most fighters in the air. It didn't shake or stall. It just wanted to keep going. But without the right engine, it wouldn't be enough. That breakthrough would come soon. For now, the Allies had found a shape that worked. All they needed was the power to match. In the meantime, the bomber losses continued. But the buzz about this new aircraft began to spread. Pilots talked about it. Mechanics studied it. And in high command, the idea took root. Maybe this was the Escort they had been searching for. The Mustang was about to get its teeth. But even before that, it had shown something rare in war potential. It's the kind that changes everything. if given the chance. The Mustang's shape was right. Its design was near perfect. But to truly become a war changer, it needed something more power. That power came from across the Atlantic. The early Mustangs had the Allison engine. It worked well at low altitudes, but above 15,000 feet, it lost strength. And that's where the air war over Europe lived in the cold. Thin air where bombers flew and enemy fighters hunted. Enter the Merlin. Rolls-Royce had spent years refining the Merlin engine. It powered the Spitfire, the Hurricane, even the Lancaster bomber. It had two-stage superchargers that kept it strong at high altitudes. It purred with reliability. It roared when pushed. A few RAF engineers had a wild idea. What if they fit the British Merlin into the American Mustang? The first tests were promising. The moment the engine started, the plane transformed. Pilots felt the difference in seconds. It climbed faster, cruised higher, and when they pushed the throttle, it didn't fade, it soared. North American aviation took note. So did Packard, an American company licensed to build the Merlin in the U.S. They retooled their factories. The merger became official. The Mustang would now carry the Merlin heart inside its long nose. The results were immediate. The P-51B, the first true long-range Escort version, had everything: speed, altitude, range, firepower, and handling. It could fly to Berlin, fight the enemy, and fly back on a single tank of gas, thanks to its efficient airframe and drop tanks. It wasn't just fast. It was balanced, deadly, predictable in the best way. Pilots said it became part of their body in flight. It responded like a glove, tight and smooth. By late 1943, the Allies knew they had something special. The Mustang with a Merlin was not just another fighter, was a game breaker. At first, the Germans didn't know what they were facing. Luftwaffe pilots saw these strange planes far deeper over Germany than expected. They assumed it was a new P-47, but something felt off. These aircraft stayed longer, climbed faster, dogfought harder, and they kept coming, mission after mission. The Mustang's full arrival was timed perfectly. The U.S. was preparing for a massive campaign. Big week. The goal was simple bomb Germany's war machine into the ground. But this time, the bombers would not go alone. The Mustang was ready. It had the range. It had the power. And soon, it would have the chance to show the world what it could do. February 1944. The skies above Europe were crowded with the roar of engines. Dozens, then hundreds of silver bombers crossed into German airspace. Below them, flak guns waited. Above, radar stations tracked their path. And circling just behind the bombers, something new shimmered in the cold sky. The P-51 Mustang had arrived. This was the beginning of Big Week, a full-force campaign to cripple German aircraft production. Allied planners knew the bombers alone wouldn't survive. But now, for the first time, they had true escorts that could fly the full distance, deep into the heart of Germany, even to Berlin. The Germans were watching. Their radar picked up the incoming wave. At first, they were not surprised. Allied bombers had struck before, but then something odd appeared on their screens. Fast-moving contacts, keeping pace with the bombers. Not turning back, not retreating at the old limits. They were going further, closer, almost all the way. Luftwaffe controllers sent out alerts. Pilots scrambled to intercept. The airfields near Berlin buzzed with movement. Commanders expected another easy trap. Wait for the escorts to turn, then rip the bombers apart. But that trap never closed. The escorts kept coming. In Berlin, civilians looked up from the streets. Sirens echoed across the rooftops. Searchlights sliced the sky. And then, a new shape crossed overhead, sleek, long-nosed, fast. A Mustang. Allied bombers rumbled above the capital for the first time, with protection flying right beside them. And when the German fighters came to strike, they met the new defenders head-on. One Luftwaffe pilot described it later. We rose expecting B-17s and P-47s. Instead, we saw something faster, climbing higher than us, and it stayed. We didn't understand. How could they still be here? In the first clash over Berlin, the Mustangs didn't just escort, they hunted. They engaged Me-109s and FW-190s over their own cities. It stunned German pilots. Many had grown used to attacking bombers with little resistance after a certain point in the mission. That day, it felt like the rules had changed. Back at Allied air bases, pilots landed the new Mustangs with fuel to spare. The mission was a success. Bombs fell on German industry. Escorts returned intact. Commanders stared at the charts and saw something different. For the first time, the losses were dropping. And deep inside the Luftwaffe, doubt began to spread. Back in their bunkers and airfields, German commanders gathered around radar screens and blackboards filled with chalked flight paths. The reports from the Berlin sector were troubling. Something had changed. The American bombers were no longer vulnerable after the halfway mark. The skies they once owned in defense were now filled with unfamiliar, fast-moving enemy fighters. At Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter wings, pilots reviewed the strange encounter. They had scrambled, expecting P-47 Thunderbolts, heavy and quick to retreat. Instead, they found aircraft that matched their speed, responded faster in turns, and refused to disengage. These fighters loitered over Berlin itself. They waited. One pilot wrote in his log, "They circled like hawks. Not once did they break and run." It was as if they had come to stay. The new fighters weren't just fast, they were persistent. And that broke every expectation the Germans had built over years of combat. Mechanics walked the flight lines, repairing damaged 109s and FW-190s. Some bore new holes from .50 caliber rounds that had punched through their armor in high-speed chases. Others never returned at all. The losses were mounting, and nobody could explain exactly how these new aircraft had stayed so deep for so long. Word filtered upward to the high command. Reports arrived on Hermann Göring's desk. First disbelief, then frustration. How could the Americans have found a fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back? He had promised Hitler that Germany controlled the skies. Now, that control was slipping fast. Luftwaffe radar operators noticed more patterns. The strange escorts were appearing earlier and staying later. They sometimes left no time for counterattack. A bomber stream would approach, and just as German fighters lifted off to intercept, the escorts were already overhead. Pilots started referring to them as the ghosts, not because they couldn't see them, but because they couldn't escape them. Over time, a name began circulating among the crews: Mustang. At first, it was just another Allied aircraft, but after the Berlin raid, it became something else entirely, symbol of the shifting balance. Fighter-to-fighter kill ratios started to favor the Allies. The Luftwaffe seasoned aces were being picked off. Younger recruits stood little chance. The Mustang had not only reached Berlin, it had stayed. It had fought. And it had won. The sun was sinking low behind the jagged horizon when the last of the German fighters limped home. Their engines coughed and sputtered. Black smoke trailed behind them. Ground crews rushed to meet the damaged aircraft, eyes wide at the holes punched clean through their wings and fuselage. It wasn't just the losses that stunned the Luftwaffe that day. It was the presence. The Americans had come deep, farther than they ever had before. That was not new. What was new was that they stayed. Long after the bombs had fallen, long after the formation should have turned for home, the enemy fighters were still up there, waiting, watching, hunting. At a field near Leipzig, a young pilot stumbled from his cockpit, pale and drenched in sweat. He'd spent most of his flight looking over his shoulder, evading a silver shape that just wouldn't leave him. His wingman hadn't returned. His voice was low as he said it. They were still there, 8 hours in the air, and they hadn't gone home. In briefing rooms across Germany, officers leaned over maps, drawing lines and scratching their heads. How was it possible? The calculations didn't make sense. No fighter should have that range. No escort should be able to follow a bombing raid to Berlin and then stay behind for dogfights on the return. But the evidence was clear. The same planes were showing up before, during, and after the raid. Intercepted, engaged, pursued, and survived. Pilots who once called American fighters sluggish now had different names for the new ones. Some called them ghosts, others wolves. They came out of the sky fast, fired with precision, and vanished. One mechanic inspecting a damaged Bf-109 found the entry wounds grouped so tightly it looked like the work of a sniper. In the bunkers beneath Berlin, word began to spread. It's not just among the flight crews, but up the chain of command. These weren't Thunderbolts. They weren't Lightnings. They were something new. Sleek, fast, long-legged, and they were changing the air war. The Mustang wasn't just escorting bombers. It was challenging the Luftwaffe in its own backyard. It was breaking the pattern, changing the rhythm of battle, and turning the skies over Germany into dangerous territory for the defenders. That day, the Luftwaffe learned something they hadn't expected. The Americans weren't just coming in force, they were coming to stay. The morning after the Berlin raid, German airfields were quiet, not out of peace, but because so many aircraft had failed to return. Those who had survived were shaken. In the mess halls, they whispered about the new fighters. No one called them weak anymore. The Americans had brought something different, something that could fly like a hawk and hit like a hammer. By midday, the next raid was already forming over England. Hundreds of B-17s lined the runways. Alongside them, the silver P-51 Mustangs were fueled and armed. Pilots checked their oxygen masks, their radios, their ammo belts. They had seen what their planes could do. Now they were going back. Above the clouds, the formation moved like a steel river. The sun caught the wings, turning the sky into a field of glinting metal. At the edges of the bomber groups, the Mustangs weaved and darted, scanning for movement. Their role was clear: protect the bombers, fight the enemy, and never let them near the formation. Over the German countryside, Luftwaffe interceptors scrambled again. Dozens of Bf-109s and FW-190s clawed their way into the sky, but this time they didn't catch the bombers off guard. This time, the Mustangs were waiting. The dogfights erupted in the high, thin air. Engines roared. Gunfire streaked across the sky. A Mustang dived from above, its guns lighting up a 109 below. Another circled behind a German ace, forcing him into a desperate spin. The speed, the precision, the confidence, it was like facing a different air force entirely. From the ground, civilians looked up and saw the sky torn by contrails and smoke. Pieces of aircraft tumbled from the clouds. Parachutes bloomed. And still, the Mustangs stayed. They chased attackers even as they tried to escape. They flew alongside the bombers for hours, through flak, through fuel limits, through fear. One German pilot, captured after bailing out, said later, in the days that followed, German commanders reviewed the kill reports. The numbers were grim. More planes lost, more aces gone, fewer victories. And the bombers, they had made it. Many were damaged, but they had struck deep, and the Mustangs had brought them back. The skies over Berlin were no longer a safe haven. The Luftwaffe had lost its edge. The Americans weren't just bombing, they were taking control of the air itself. The sky was quiet now. Trails of smoke still marked where planes had fallen, but the battle had moved on. Below, Berlin smoldered. Above, scattered contrails curved like ghosts of a vanished fight. On both sides, the cost had been high, but for the Luftwaffe, something deeper had broken. Back at the airfield, the surviving German pilots climbed down from their cockpits slowly. Some limped, others carried injuries that would take weeks to heal, but all wore the same expression: fatigue, confusion, and disbelief. In the debriefing rooms, commanders pressed for answers. What had happened? Why had so many planes been lost? The pilots could only repeat the same message. The new American fighters had stayed with the bombers for the entire mission, 8 hours. From takeoff in England to the target in Berlin and back again, the Mustangs had never left. That changed everything. For the Luftwaffe had known how to time their attacks. They waited until the short-range escorts turned back, then launched their fighters to strike. But now there was no gap, no weakness. The Mustangs flew in formation, they dove in pairs, they covered each other. And when a German fighter tried to strike, it was he who became the target. Some veteran pilots walked out in silence. Others slumped in their chairs, staring at maps that no longer made sense. One young ace, barely 22, said quietly, "We are no longer the hunters." At Allied command, the tone was different. Reports poured in confirming bomber losses were dropping. Damage to German industry was rising. And for the first time, the bombing missions weren't just about survival. They were working. General Doolittle's gamble had paid off. The Mustang had lived up to its promise, and now bomber crews who once felt helpless could fly with confidence, knowing the Mustangs had their backs. In Berlin, high command met in tense silence. Interceptors were vanishing faster than they could be replaced. Factories were being hit more often and harder. The railway yards, the ball-bearing plants, the fuel depots, nothing was safe anymore. And still, the Mustangs came. Pilots like Johann Steinhoff began to write in their logs that the balance of the air war had tipped. In private conversations, German officers admitted that without new technology or reinforcements, they would lose control of the skies altogether. The Reich's greatest fear had taken shape. It wasn't just that the enemy had better numbers, it was that they had built a plane that could go farther, fight longer, and protect their bombers the whole way through. It was a quiet defeat, not announced with trumpets, but whispered in the hangars and briefing rooms, where even the bravest pilots now hesitated before walking to their aircraft. The Mustang had changed the rhythm of the war, and Germany had no answer. From the sky, The landscape of Germany had changed. What once was a proud engine of war smokestacks rising, trains moving with precision, factories humming was now scarred. Flames crawled across fuel depots. Assembly lines lay twisted in rubble. Supply chains slowed to a crawl. The bombs were reaching their targets, and the reason was clear. The Mustangs were staying the course. For months, Allied bombers had suffered terrible losses trying to punch into Germany's industrial heartland. Every mission deeper than the Rhine had meant dozens of aircraft lost. Without fighter cover, B-17s and B-24s had been easy prey for waiting interceptors. But now, those days were over. With the Mustang, the Allies had unlocked the skies. Missions that once felt suicidal became strategic. Formation after formation of silver bombers flew over hostile land with American fighters beside them from takeoff to return. The Germans no longer had the advantage of timing or territory. At briefing tables across England, bomber crews felt the shift. Veteran pilots who had once written goodbye letters before every mission now walked into their cockpits with a quiet confidence. One gunner was heard whispering before takeoff, "If the Mustangs are with us, we'll make it home." And they did. Strategic targets that had eluded Allied destruction for years now fell one by one. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, the oil refineries at Merseburg, the aircraft plants at Leipzig. Each strike weakened Germany's ability to fight. Not just today, but tomorrow. By early spring, the change was undeniable. German fighter squadrons were thinning. Replacement pilots were younger, less trained. Fuel shortages began to ground more aircraft than enemy bullets. And still the Mustangs came, slicing through cloud and flak, answering every ambush with aggression. American commanders pressed the advantage. General Spaatz ordered deeper raids. General Doolittle gave Mustang squadrons permission to roam ahead of bomber groups, hunting German fighters wherever they launched. This sky, once a chessboard of cautious moves, became a battlefield ruled by speed and range. For the Germans, it was suffocating. Fighter pilots no longer held the initiative. Control towers issued warnings, but by then, it was too late. The Mustangs were already overhead. One Luftwaffe officer wrote bitterly in his journal, "It is no longer a question of bravery. It is a question of inevitability. They are there before we are." The tide had turned, not with a dramatic explosion or a single battle, but through months of relentless pressure. The Mustang was the scalpel that opened Germany's industrial heart and bled it dry. For the Allies, victory in the air meant freedom on the ground. As bombs shattered rail yards and factories, German divisions at the front began to feel the lack of supplies. Tanks sat idle. Ammunition ran thin, and the soldiers who once marched with confidence now watched the sky with dread. In this quiet devastation, the P-51 Mustang had proven itself, not just as a machine of war, but as the key to air dominance. It had opened the door to Berlin, and soon the rest of the war would follow through. The war was not yet over, but the writing was already in the clouds. From early 1944 onward, the skies above Europe no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. They belonged to the Mustang. Historians would later say that the P-51 was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. They were right. But what made the Mustang different was timing. It arrived at the exact moment the Allies needed it most, and it delivered something no other aircraft had before: complete reach. Before the Mustang, Allied bombers flew into danger like runners without shields. After the Mustang, they flew into Germany with a sword at their side. It was the turning point in the air war. Back at Allied command, generals studied the results. Bombing accuracy was improving. Bomber losses were dropping. Interceptor attacks were being broken up before they could even form. The numbers told one story, but the enemy told another. Captured German pilots often spoke of the silver shadows. They described how Mustangs would appear suddenly, far from the front, even beyond Berlin, and how no safe zone remained. One Luftwaffe ace, frustrated and grounded by fuel shortages, confessed during interrogation, "It is not the bombers that are killing us. It is the fighters." The Mustang had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol, a sleek machine of speed and range, built not to bomb cities, but to protect those who did. Its pilots were knights of the sky, chasing down the last remnants of Germany's once proud Air Force, and its legacy would reach far beyond the war. After the fall of Berlin, the Mustang continued to serve across the globe, in Korea, in the hands of other nations. Even in air shows decades later, its howl would stir something deep in the hearts of veterans and children alike. Engineers would remember it as a triumph of design. Pilots would remember it as a partner in survival. And the enemy would remember it as the point when they lost the sky. All this came from a plane once rushed into existence in just over 3 months. Born in a time of urgency, perfected with a borrowed engine, and proven over the heart of a continent in flames. The Mustang had not ended the war on its own, but it had changed the rules. Before, the enemy had dictated when and where the fight would come. After the Mustang, the Allies chose the time, the place, and the outcome. In the end, it was more than just a machine with wings. It was the answer to a question that had haunted the skies for years. Could the bombers ever make it home? With the Mustang flying beside them, they could. And they did.